This is a story called Pointy Wood by Emma Thacker. It's a story I wrote many years ago about the origins of trees. A sort of fable, if you will. It might not be exactly what you're thinking. A long, long time ago, trees used to talk and walk and do everything that we do. They would enjoy making the dinner and playing with their children, or go and see their granny tree for the weekend. But what they enjoyed doing most was terrifying the villagers. The villagers were scared of the tree monsters and would hide inside their sturdy mud and stone huts until the trees had gone. The huts looked like pebbles to the gigantic tree monsters, so as long as the villagers stayed inside, they would be all right. The tree monsters loved scaring the villagers. When they got bored of pruning their nails or sharpening their teeth, sometimes they would find a man going for a walk down to the river, sneak up on him and throw him about like a ball, or find a little girl drawing pictures in the dusty mud with a shell, and pick her up by the pigtails and use her to draw their pictures with. The villagers somehow managed to tolerate even this, but one day the monsters went too far. One morning the farmer was on his way to the tall grass field to collect some more grass so it could dry out in the midday sun, ready for the cold weather season as fuel for the fires. He didn't realize he was being followed until it was too late. He saw a shadow creep over his shoulder, heard the creaking of the bony monster's branches, and smelled the strong odour of redwood, the biggest of all trees, drawing near. He turned to face his torture, his eyes full of fear as he saw a gigantic, gnarled hand reach towards him. The tree monster let out a laugh so loud that the grass in the field shook as if a strong wind had blown it. The farmer let out a cry so loud that the village all heard it. The villagers hid as far out of sight of the monster as they could. No one had ever known the monsters to be this violent before. Not even the elders of the village had heard tales of this strength from their grandparents. After the trees had tired of their sport, those who could ran to get him. All the people were very sad and angry about what had just happened to the poor farmer, and came to the conclusion that something must be done. They decided to hold a meeting in the centre of the village that very afternoon to see who had the best idea of how to get rid of the tree monsters forever. Everyone that was able to make it was there. The most important of all the elders was in charge of the meeting, although he began to have a bit of trouble controlling the rest of the villagers due to their overexcitement in suggesting ways of getting rid of the beasts. "Chop their heads off!" shouted one man at the top of his voice. "Fry them alive!" screamed another. This was followed by cheers of agreement, or by even more vicious suggestions. The elder in charge eventually managed to settle the angry crowd down. "Now," he said, "we have to find a solution which is a lot less violent than your previous suggestions if we're going to get anywhere. We don't want to sink down to their level, do we?" The rest of the crowd tried to think hard. They looked bewildered as they ummed and erred and made various other noises heard in times of deep thought and confusion, until a small hand was raised, accompanied by a cough to get their attention. The small hand and small cough belonged to a small man with a beard who was attempting to stand on tiptoes to make himself seen amongst the taller crowd of people. His beard was long, beginning to turn grey, and somewhat pointy in appearance. In fact, he seemed a very pointy-looking person altogether. The elder noticed his attempts to be seen, and made a gesture that seemed to sweep the crowd away automatically, leaving the somewhat nervous man in full view of everybody.
"You have a solution to our problem?"
queried the elder. The poor man looked very nervous, and kept wringing his hands as if he was trying to dry them out. But after a few awkward seconds of silence, he calmly delivered his solution. "We could cast a spell on them to make them useful to us rather than—" he trailed off. The elder looked intrigued and immersed himself in thought as the others began to react to his words. "A spell? A spell?" repeated the others between themselves.
"But who could invent such a spell?"
The elder grinned at this question. He already knew the answer. The others noticed his expression, and all turned to look at the nervous, pointy little man. He blushed and looked shyly towards the crowd. "I can," he breathed. It was finally decided. A spell would be cast on the entire population of tree monsters to turn them from barbarians to useful monuments. The villagers had decided to lure them to an open space away from the huts where Mr. Pointy himself would carry out the spell. They all knew that it was usual for the beasts to come out and play just after lunchtime, so they can wear off their lunch of gigantic mud pies. It was therefore that time of day that was chosen for the deed. To avoid another scene like the last attack, the elder suggested that they cast this spell as soon as possible. The next day they would be fighting for their future. The time had come for the village to participate in the event that would change life for generations to come. They ate their lunch with gusto, building up their strength enough to follow their plan through. They had no sooner cleared away the remnants of their meals than they were outside, standing on the edge of the village, where no human or animal had ever dared to go at this hour. There was a definite shift in the atmosphere. They were no longer scared, but filled with anticipation of the amazing deed they were about to undertake. It had begun. A massive rumbling was heard in the distance, which made the ground shake with the force of a herd of elephants, as if the earth itself would crumble under their footsteps. To accompany this tragic orchestra of sound came a crashing down of the backdrop to this living play. A cloud of darkness on the horizon alerted the silent army to the imminent arrival of their enemy. The whispers amongst the crowd, waiting on the boundary, ceased abruptly as the faces of the trees came into view. Their time was here, and they knew it. They knew they must act quickly to avoid disaster. Huge grins became visible on the wrinkled faces of the monsters, obviously delighted to find a great deal more playmates than usual, already dreaming up all the bizarre and cruel means of torture possible which they could fully enjoy carrying out. They were too busy thinking about the fun they would have to even begin thinking about why the puny little humans were all standing facing them in a large group and not even running away. The tree monsters did not have room inside their small brains for even such basic feelings of self-preservation. They reasoned that because they were bigger, they were stronger, and that was an end to it. How wrong could they be? The trees got closer and closer. Mr. Pointy, as he had become affectionately known, was beginning to sweat. Beads of water passed over his brow, eventually ending up in a rather soggy pointy beard. The tension grew as the trees neared the determined faces of the village. When the trees were close enough for the villagers to smell the damp, rotting smell that the trees leaked from every groove in their trunk, and this was quite a distance, They ran. They flew away from the village with tremendous speed, Mr. Pointy's legs carrying him as fast as they could. They glided through the grass field, constantly making sure that the trees were still following. And then they stopped. They had come to a halt at the top of a large hill, and they waited. They didn't have long to wait. The trees, with their mighty legs, had kept up all the way and weren't even so much as out of breath. The trees stood looking down in glee at their prize. They began to pick out individuals in their mind to perform various grisly things on, as they rubbed their hands together and grinned menacingly. The villagers looked towards the all-important spellcaster and motioned him forwards. The trees all looked towards the leader, the redwood, as he stepped forwards to be the first to take his pick. Mr. Pointy and Redwood stood opposite each other, sizing each other up, staring each other in the eyes, with both sides of their teams urging the leader of the group to just get on with it. It was all going to end here and now for someone, and they both knew it. But the trees didn't know what the humans had planned. Mr. Pointy raised his hands and began to speak out loud in an ancient language unknown to all but him. The muttering in both crowds of people ceased as they looked on in awe at the bearded magician. The trees had no idea what he was up to or how to react to this, but after a few more words they decided that enough was enough. The games should begin. They tried to move a step closer to their prey to move in for the grab, but found themselves rooted to the ground. They could not understand it. They pulled and struggled in a futile attempt to free themselves, but nothing they could do would work. In a final attempt to gain what they had set out for, the trees reached forward with the only limbs they could still move. Mr. Pointy finished the last few words of his secret incantation as the trees raised their arms together as a final gesture of greed. Finally, they were completely frozen. The villagers looked on in awe and amazement at what they saw next. The facial features of those once destructive beasts were beginning to fade into the same texture as their rough skin. Some of the younger trees grew thinner and smoother with an almost silver-like quality in appearance. Everyone gathered round Mr. Pointy, congratulating him on his success, holding him up high, to be seen by all as cheers of happiness from the hill and from the village below could be heard for miles. Everybody's attention was entirely focused on Mr. Pointy, except one person. "Let's go and celebrate with a feast," suggested one woman as they all cheered in agreement until they heard a cry from the tree's final resting place. The crowd stopped and turned to see what the fuss was about. "Isn't it beautiful?" cried one person. One person after another repeated each other. They were right. Green leaves were sprouting on the branches of all different shapes and sizes, and beautiful blooms of pink and white flourished on others. It was enough to bring some of them to tears. The villagers were so pleased with what they had created that they planted some of the trees around their village alongside the flowers. They soon found that trees also had seeds that grew into more trees, which led to the discovery of wood and paper. The rest of the tree monsters around the world created large forests for birds and animals to live in. And what happened to Mr. Pointy? Well, he married a pointy wife, had 2 lovely pointy children, invented pointy-shaped trees, and lived pointily ever after. And that is where trees came from.